Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Taiwan Bridges Lecture in Academia Sinica. We're very honored today to have Sir Richard Roberts, the 1993 Nobel Laureate in Physiology or Medicine, as our speaker today. Before the lecture, the President of Academia Sinica, Dr. James Liao, will deliver his opening remarks. Please join me in welcoming President Liao.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first welcome you to Academia Sinica's fifth Nobel Bridge Lecture. This year, we are very pleased to have invited 11 Nobel laureates, going on probably will be 12 very soon. And this is the fifth event. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm extremely honored to have Sir Richard Roberts to give this lecture. I think most of the life scientists will know that Dr. Richard Roberts is the discoverer of intron, and that changed the whole concept of molecular biology. But for me, I'm very impressed by one paper he published about 10 years ago in 2015. I think it's in PLOS Computational Biology. And the title is 10 Easiest Way to Win a Nobel Prize. And rule number one is don't even think about it. So I'm sure you'll enjoy his very insightful ideas about science and GMO in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Liao. Please let's invite today's moderator, Dr. Lin, to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chen Lin. As a RNA biologist working on RNA splicing, it is my true honor to introduce today's previous speaker, Sir Richard Roberts, the 1993 Nobel laureate for his discovery of split genes. So in 1977, Dr. Richard Roberts and his colleague Phil Sharp discovered the intron-exon, this unique genetic architecture that's universal for all eukaryotes. And this discovery opens an entirely new field to understand the eukaryotic gene expression, not to mention how alternative splicing shapes each and every cell of us. And this discovery has kept us busy for nearly 50 years. And now each day we continue to be surprised by its very amazing regulation and also its pathological implications. Sir Richard was not born as a molecular biologist. Born in 1943 in England, the young Richard was fascinated by mathematics and logical puzzles. Actually, his childhood dream was to become a detective who could be paid by solving puzzles. And later, his interest shifted to chemistry. He spent much of his youth on experimenting with fireworks, chemical mixtures, fortunately, safely enough. And these experiments eventually led him to the bachelor's study in chemistry and also PhD degree in organic chemistry. And up to this point, Sir Richard hasn't studied anything about gene yet. And through studying, reading books in molecular biology, Sir Richard decided to join a biochemistry lab in Harvard for his postdoctoral research, where he learned all the biology jargons like DNA and RNA, etc. And also he mastered the sequencing technique, so he determined the tRNA sequence there. And this experience then led him to an offer from Gene Watson at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, where their goal was to decipher the adenovirus sequence. And you know what happened then, right? Working with viruses, Sir Richard and his colleagues discovered this very amazing and astonishing loop structure under EM. Okay, they saw because of the imperfect matching between the DNA and RNA molecule, they concluded that mRNA only inherited fragmented and discontinuous information from the DNA. And this looping structure of EM now become the textbook standard illustration. And also during his time at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, Sir Richard initiated another equally transformative project, that is to identify restriction enzymes. Nearly 2/3 of the world's first restriction enzymes were identified or characterized at Sir Richard's lab. But then he failed to convince Jim Watson to set up a company and sell them at Cold Spring Harbor because Watson didn't think they will make any money. So Sir Richard then turned to his friend Don Combe, who managed to sell the restriction enzyme collections from a basement operation with only 3 people. And this company is called New England Biolabs. I believe all of you know. Unlike some big shot scientists, Sir Richard never aimed for, prizes. And the first major prize he received was the Nobel Prize in 1993. And yet, Sir Richard didn't stop his adventure there. In 2013, I believe, at a birthday gathering of his good friend Mark Van Montagu, Sir Richard came to deeply understand the challenges of using genetically modified crops to address the nutrient deficiency in developing countries. Therefore, since then, he devoted himself in advocating the use of GMO foods. He collected 183 signatures from Nobel laureates to support the development and use of GMOs. So today we are going to hear more about his adventure. So please join me to warmly welcome Sir Richard Roberts.
So what I'm going to try to convince you today is that not only me, but you should love GMOs too. And I'm going to tell you why they're A, really important, B, why the world needs them, and especially the developing countries, and C, while there are certain groups of people who are anti-GMO who are really causing tremendous harm in the world, literally killing people by advocating against GMOs. Now, one of the things that's happening at the moment is that climate change is really devastating life as we know it. So many things are being screwed up because the climate is changing. For instance, greenhouse gas emissions are a major problem. It turns out there is a lady in Sheffield who's been working out how to engineer crops so that they will suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And if we took all of the world's crops at the moment that we grow and used some genetically modified crops, we could go a long way to removing CO2 and methane from the atmosphere. But for the 800 million people who go to bed hungry every night, food is the medicine they need. They're not looking for antibiotics, they're not looking for heart transplants, they just need food. 800 million people go to bed hungry every night. It's hard to believe. And this was what made me get involved in this whole movement. As you just heard, I met Mark van Montague, who had one of the two people who developed the original method for making a genetically modified crop, just following something that nature was already doing. And there was a celebration of his birthday, and I was invited to go and talk at this meeting. But I was the only person who was not a plant biochemist or biologist who was there. And I'm listening to all of these people in Europe saying how difficult it was to do agricultural research in Europe. Because every time they would give a talk, Greenpeace would show up and they'd send activists and they'd try to harass people. They'd try to stop the presentation. And they also try to stop the funding. And I'll tell you some more about that later. But I was so appalled by what I saw. And I'd been asked to go and talk to the European Commission the following day about the future of healthcare. Not that I claimed to know very much about that, but I could talk about vaccines and various other things. And I decided after hearing this talk that I was going to go and talk to the European Commission and make the case that food is medicine. If you're hungry, food is what you need. You don't need all these fancy things. And so I gave that talk, and after the talk, an Italian senator came up to me and she said, "That was incredible." She said, "I'd never heard any of this before. And I'd been totally opposed to GMOs because of what I'd heard, because of what Greenpeace had been saying, what other people had been saying. And she said, I'm going to change my mind and I'm going to vote in favor of GMOs." And a number of other staff members for people from Europe were there, from the Senate on the Commission. And they said the same thing, that they just never heard this story in Europe because Greenpeace would normally harass them, stop them talking about it, and so on. And so that's how this campaign got started, how I got interested in GMOs. And when I talked to some people about it, they said, well, one of the things that happens is that if you work in the field, maybe in industry, maybe in academic life, that Greenpeace would accuse you of just talking about something that was self-interest. They would say, oh, you can't listen to this guy. He works for a company that makes agricultural products. Or here's an academic talking about it. They just want grants. They don't care about anything else. And so I was persuaded by several people that I could speak about this because I'm not in the field. Nothing about it. So I couldn't be attacked for trying to promote my own self-interests or my company's self-interests. So that's how I got involved in all of this, and that is the background. So I went and talked to a few of my Nobel laureate friends, and I said, I think we should do something about this. I talked to them, and I was encouraged to pursue it, to continue talking about it. And I slowly gathered a bunch of Nobel laureates together until eventually we had 100. And then we went formal with the campaign. We had a press conference in Washington and said people should be pro-GMO. They should not be anti-GMO. Now, I'll tell you a background about why you should not worry about this. But the term genetically modified organism is really misleading. Not one of you in this room is not genetically modified. Okay? When your parents gave birth to you, you got some genes from your mother, you got some genes from your father. That's genetic modification. Every life form on this planet, everything, is genetically modified. So how come it's all so dangerous? Are we all dangerous because we're genetically modified? And the other thing is that when you ask, well, how were the plants developed that we grow today, corn and so on, how were they developed? Well, it turned out that they've been breeding plants for many, many years. In fact, since before Christ, people started modifying these plants and picking the ones that grew best, that had the best yields, and so on. And did that by genetic modification. They call it plant breeding. Sometimes it's just crossing two plants and getting the mixed genes. Other times it's irradiating the plants or using chemicals to induce mutation to try to get better crops. That's all genetic modification. And it's really silly for anybody to try to pretend that it is not genetic modification. But one of the problems with that is that when you take two plants, cross them, you get the genes from one, genes from another, and usually it's only one or two of those genes that you're interested in, the ones that perhaps make it grow better, the ones that produce a bigger flower, the ones that do something a little better. It's not all the genes, and yet you don't know which ones it is. And so this is something that is a bit of a problem. And the problem is that within the anti-GMO movement, hypocrisy just abounds, hypocrisy everywhere. So, I'm sure there are one or two diabetics in the audience. You know where you get the insulin from? Have you ever been to an insulin donation clinic where you can take human insulin and donate it so that it can be given to the diabetics? No, because that's not how you get the insulin. You get the insulin by producing either a fungus or a bacterium, putting in the gene for human insulin, and then growing it in the lab. This is the classic genetic modification. I want to know why the anti-GMO people don't object to that. Well, of course I know, because it's a life-saving treatment. It's something that is needed, and it's perfectly safe. And in fact, genetic modification of plants has turned out to be perfectly safe too. We've been doing it now for more than 30 years, and there's not been a single case of a problem. Not one problem with this. Millions of people have eaten genetically modified plants of one sort and another. Why do they accept vaccines for COVID so quickly? These were produced by genetic modification of one sort and another. Why do the anti-GMO people not object to that? Well, again, it's easy. It's a pharmaceutical. It actually saves people's lives. But food also saves people's lives. Why would they not support that? And I think one of the things that I'm most surprised about in Europe is that the animals that they grow in Europe for food are all fed with genetically modified crops that come from South America or come from other places. So it's perfectly okay to take genetically modified plants, feed them to the cattle, feed them to the sheep, feed them to the pigs. This is perfectly safe. But if I give you just one GMO, it's dangerous. It's absolutely stupid. How on earth can anyone make this argument in all seriousness? Well, of course, I will explain to you in a moment why they get away with it. When I started the campaign, we really went public with it when we had 100 laureates. We now have 183 laureates who've signed on to it. When I made the first, we sent a letter. I took a letter down to the United Nations. We sent it to every ambassador for every country at the United Nations and say, you should acknowledge that genetically modified organisms, GMOs, are safe and that it's what they need in the developing world. Because you have to realize that all of the crops that we grow in the developing world have been improved by years and years of plant breeding using traditional methods, all of them. And yet, in the developing world, there's been no improvement of the plants. Why? Because the agricultural companies cannot make any money selling them to poor countries who don't have the money. There's no profit there for them, so they don't do anything. They don't want to have anything to do with them. That's really, for me, a major, major problem. And I like this cartoon that was produced by an artist in the US, over in Iowa. And he says, do you know this stuff can do to you? He's giving him some biotech food, some GMO food. says, do you know what this stuff can you do to you, hoping to scare him? The little boy says, yeah, it keeps me alive. This is what I need, food. I need food. And the nice thing is, the GMO method is so easy to do these days, to make improvements in crops, that scientists in the developing countries can do it themselves. And it's not difficult to do. In fact, since CRISPR came along, it's become even easier to do. So on the basis of that, I started this website, supportprecisionagriculture.org. You can log on to it. You can sign on and join us yourself. You can see all the laureates that have gone into it. And there's a lot of other material too, including some video recordings of talks that I've given in the past. And many slides, some of which you will see today, are all there. If you want to use them yourself, you can download them. I don't keep them secret or anything. They're for anybody who wants to use them. Now, food means agriculture. You know, if you live in a city like Taipei, you don't grow your food in the backyard. You go around to the supermarket. And the supermarkets, their food from farmers, from agriculture. And agriculture for 10, 12,000 years, we've been using crude genetic techniques to slowly improve the crops. But in the 1980s, Mark van Montague and Jeff Shell figured out how to take genes, specific genes, and put them into the plant that you want to put them in. And so you can imagine that there are many specific genes and gene products that you would like to put in a plant in order to make it grow better. They figured out how to do this. And this was when Greenpeace first started to get active and started to make problems. And one of the things they said right at the start was, well, this is a very new technique. We don't know how dangerous this could be. What we need is to get some science done so that we can see whether this is dangerous or whether it's not. Well, more than 30 years later, they're saying the same thing. And it's not about the danger. This was just a convenience for them, unfortunately. Let's look at the plant breeding methods. Plant breeding, traditional breeding, 50-50 mixture of genes, just like you from your parents. The original GMO method, which Mark van Montague and Jeff Shell developed, they could take a gene, move it into a plant, but they didn't know where it was going to go. And they had to look at it later and figure out where it had gone. But today, we have CRISPR methods. These are very, very good methods for introducing genes into plants or any organism you choose, and they're very specific. You can set it up so you know exactly where the gene is going to go, put in 1 gene, 2 genes, however many genes you want, and you can select the location where you're going to put it so that it doesn't interfere with something else that the plant might be doing. You could not say that for the original GMO method. But now, as a result of this, it's very easy to manipulate plants with CRISPR, to put in the genes that you want to go in, and you can have a ball with this. And the nice thing is you don't need to be an agricultural company in order to do it. Scientists in the developing world can do this very easily. They can do it themselves. They can improve the crops that are normally grown in the country where they live. Let me tell you, I like to use this example for people who are not scientists or people who are in disciplines other than science, to give you an idea of what I mean by the CRISPR method of moving genes from one position into a new plant. Imagine that I want to take a GPS system from my old car and put it in my new car. What should I do? Should I take the 2 cars apart, mix the parts of the car, and then pick up the new one that has the GPS system in it. Well, no, there's a slightly better way than that to do it. You unplug the GPS system from one car and plug it into the other. That's the CRISPR method of making GMOs. Unplug the gene from one organism and put it into the organism where you want it to go. You take a GPS system from an aeroplane and put it in a car. Does this mean the car's going to fly? Greenpeace would have you believe, well, you take a gene from a fish and put it into a plant, the plant's going to swim. I mean, this is the way in which they talk. It is so unscientific and such nonsense. And yet people have been listening to this. It boggles the imagination of anybody who can think logically. And the thing is that when you make anything new, a drug, a plant, whatever it is, what's important is the product. What is the final product? Doesn't matter how you make it. If I take my wife into a clothing store and I ask her, find a nice dress that you like. She will go and look and she'll find the dress that she loves. But she doesn't say, how was that made? I don't want to buy that one. It wasn't made properly. That's not what you do. You look at the quality of the product. It's either okay or it's not okay. And the same should be true for GMOs and GMO crops. It's the product that is important. That's what matters. Now, one thing that is kind of interesting is plants are a little different from many organisms. There are lots of things that like to eat plants. They can't run away from predators, though. If you're a rat or a mouse and an eagle's coming to get you, you can run away. Plants can't do that. And so how is it that plants have managed to survive all of the predators that are out there trying to eat them? Well, they protect themselves with pesticides. They manufacture their own pesticides that will kill organisms that eat them. A good example is celery. I particularly like this one. Celery has a number of pesticides in it, but it's the methoxysorolins that are the worst. And these, if you just soak yourself in celery juice, which is what people harvesting celery and putting it into packages for sale in the supermarket used to do. They didn't wear gloves. They got the juice all over their hands. And they developed a skin cancer as a result of that because of the methoxysorolin. And afterwards, it was realized that this was a problem. They started wearing gloves. And for us, the amount we get when we eat celery is so low, very, very little. And it's not a problem for us. Our body knows how to deal with it. They were never improved genetically. And so you might ask, well, Europe knows, and we in the US know, and in Taiwan, and in many other countries, we know that the people who live in developing countries don't have a lot of money, and many of them can't afford to feed their families properly. They just don't have that option. And many of them are smallholder farmers. They have a small plot of land next to their house, and that's where they have to grow whatever food they're either going to eat or barter with a neighbor. And they often can't grow enough. They can't make enough because they're growing crops that have never been bred and improved in the way that the crops we eat in the West have. And so you might ask, well, Europeans in general don't seem to be particularly bad people. Why would they not accept GMOs? Why would they not let the developing countries grow GMOs? But they don't. They don't want to do this. And in fact, Greenpeace and co, they go off proselytizing in these developing countries, telling them how dangerous they are. We'll come in a moment as to why they're doing this. But I find it appalling that they would be doing this. And I'll tell you why Europe doesn't endorse it. And I ask simply, as with many, many things, you ask why people do things. Is it politics, or is it money, or is it both? Well, the movement got started because the Europeans were a little concerned that the American agribusinesses were taking control of the food supply in Europe. And in fact, they still do to some extent. The vast majority of the seeds that are used to plant fields in Europe all come from US companies. How can that be prevented? How can you stop this? Well, you could just ban Monsanto and all the other big US businesses. Monsanto, of course, has now been bought by Bayer. But you could just ban them and say, we're not going to import these things. But that wouldn't work, and for the simple reason that they need these agribusinesses to be importing seeds. And so the Green parties came up with this solution. As soon as Monsanto introduced the first GMO crop into Europe, they made a huge mistake. First thing they did, and this was a herbicide-resistant, a glyphosate-containing plant, that was really easy to grow and didn't have the weed problems that many plants do. And they charged the farmers more money for this. And immediately Greenpeace seized upon this and said, we're going to stop that. We're going to ban GMOs, just so that they couldn't sell these improved crops that were herbicide resistant. And the best of all was that that had no economic consequence for Europe, because Europe didn't need these improved crops. They could grow their crops perfectly well. You know, I'm sure many of you have probably been to Europe and go into a restaurant and you don't have a problem finding food. There's no shortage of food in Europe, just as there isn't in most places in the West. So the Europeans started to invoke the precautionary principle. You probably have heard about this, and that is that if innovation might cause harm, doesn't have to show that it's caused harm, but if it might cause harm, and there's no proof that it's safe, then you have to wait until the scientific evidence is available. And then you can decide whether you're going to adopt it or not. But how much scientific evidence is enough? You know, is 30 years enough? 30 years of people eating these GMO plants? Well, Greenpeace apparently think you need more. They don't like that. I always like to draw the comparison here between the adoption of cell phones, right? Cell phones have been shown to be dangerous, and yet these are widely adopted. Why? Because everybody loves them. You know, I'm sure most of you in this room have a cell phone in your pocket if you're not looking at it at the moment. There are cell phones everywhere. But Europe, apparently, this is perfectly okay. The precautionary principle doesn't apply to that. And also insulin for diabetics, vaccines, and so on. So there were some things that are perfectly okay, but you apply it when you can, when you want to make a point. Now, I want to switch at this point and talk about a crop that could make a huge difference to life in the developing world. One of the big problems when you live in the developing world is that you very often don't have a sufficient amount of vitamin A when you're very young. And if babies don't get enough vitamin A as they're growing up, they can go blind, they can have all sorts of problems, cause all sorts of immune problems. And in the West, it's usually not a problem, you know. There's a precursor, beta-carotene, for vitamin A. Look at carrots. Almost any colored vegetable has beta-carotene in it. And this allows you to make vitamin A. But those are not crops that are routinely eaten in a lot of the developing country. And so Peter Jennings in 1984 suggested maybe one thing they could do was to take one of the staples of the diet in the developing world, rice, and put in the gene for beta-carotene so that it would provide the vitamin A that everybody needs when they're growing up. This was brought to fruition by Ingo Petraikas at the ETH in Zurich and by Peter Bayer at the University of Freiburg. It became a reality in February 1999, 27 years ago. Could have begun the improvements that are necessary for commercial production within 2 to 5 years, but it's a GMO and was only recently made available in the Philippines until Greenpeace then launched a campaign in the Philippines to stop them growing it. Just unbelievable. You know, the millions of children that have died because they didn't get enough vitamin A, it is quite incredible. Okay, and Greenpeace blocked the development of it. They did it deliberately. They called it a golden illusion and then claim it's taken so long to get it to a point where it can be sold, it can't possibly work. Neglecting to say that they had done everything possible themselves to stop it being developed, to stop it being made legal. And as a result of that, since 2005, millions of children, maybe 10 million children, have died or have suffered because they didn't get enough vitamin A. And if golden rice had been allowed into the countries, had been allowed to be grown, an awful lot of that can stop. I want to know, how many children have to die before we say, well, this is a crime against humanity? In my view, it is a crime against humanity. This is not something that we can do. It's not something that you can justify. Killing children is terrible. Look at the outcry from the children who get killed in Gaza. Here we're talking about millions of children, not just a few, millions. So, I want to have a little more positive note at the moment and talk to you about some positive examples of common sense. One of the genes that has been introduced into a number of plants is a toxin produced by a bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis. That gene kills a lot of insects very easily. In fact, this is what organic farmers spray on their plants instead of putting a chemical pesticide on. This gene has been put into a number of plants. And the first one up here, BT brinjal, was something that was introduced in Bangladesh many, many years ago. Brinjal is aubergine. Okay? As soon as they introduced the BT gene into brinjal, the yields went way up because the insects couldn't eat it so much anymore. And they now grow so much BT brinjal in Bangladesh, they can't eat it all. And so they export it. They have to export it. BT cotton is something else that's been a tremendous improvement. People who grow cotton, this was the first GMO crop introduced into India. This is a crop that you get enormous yields out of BT cotton because the insects are not eating the plants. BT corn, this was developed in the southern part of the USA, is now quite widespread. Has been grown for a long time in South Africa. Right next door, Zimbabwe, under Mugabe, refused to grow it because Greenpeace had gotten to Mugabe and convinced them that all GMOs were bad, and he wouldn't allow it to be grown in Zimbabwe, even though they were facing famine conditions because the farmers couldn't grow enough corn to feed the population. Well, when he finally disappeared, the following government immediately introduced BT corn into Zimbabwe, and they're starting to solve the problems there. Rainbow papaya. Papaya is a fruit, and it was introduced in the US a long time ago. It was actually, all of it pretty much is grown in Hawaii, but there was a virus that was actually killing the plants that produce papaya. And a scientist in Hawaii came up with a cure for that, basically persuaded the papaya plants to produce a vaccine against this virus. And that's been eaten in the US. Almost everybody in the US who's ever eaten papaya has eaten some of this genetically modified papaya. GMO mustard was approved in India. BT cowpea approved in Nigeria. And then golden rice, 2 years ago, was approved in the Philippines, and then Greenpeace stopped it. I find this appalling behavior. How can you do this knowing that here is a plant that can literally save lives? Terrible. There are a lot of GMO plants that are under development at the moment. So bananas, there are major problems with diseases of bananas. Bananas are very susceptible to all sorts of fungal diseases, but people have been growing and making GMO bananas in Kenya and Uganda, and they look very good. The farmers in Uganda thought that they were in great shape when these were produced. Went to the Ugandan parliament to see, well, could these be approved? Yes. Parliament said, yes, absolutely, we'll approve these. But then they had to go to the president to get the bill signed. And the president said, no, he won't sign it. And why? Because his wife and daughter had been gotten to by Greenpeace. And Greenpeace convinced them that they shouldn't approve this. They convinced the president that he shouldn't do it. And we're still waiting to see if these bananas can be approved in Uganda. Greenpeace everywhere trying to stop this. Not content with just stopping them in Europe, they want to stop them around the world. As you can see, there are a number of other things here, cassava, wheat, and so on, sorghum, other things. And in many of these cases, the improvements in the plants have been made locally by scientists in the developing world, because it is so easy now using GMO methods in order to improve these. So you have to remember that food choice for you and I, when we go to a restaurant, this is a luxury of the developed world. We have a lot of choice. You don't want to eat something, you don't eat it. You don't buy it, you don't order it in a restaurant. But don't please pretend that because something is a GMO, it's dangerous. I'm assuring you it is not. There is not one credible piece of evidence showing there has been a problem with a genetically modified plant. Not one. And if anything, they're probably safer than traditional foods. Remember the slide I showed you, when you plate traditional foods by traditional breeding, you've got all sorts of genes that go from one plant to another, and you just select the one that's picked up the gene you're looking for. Or perhaps the plant has been irradiated and you've made mutants, not just in the gene that you wanted for the plant to improve some aspect of its nutrition, but in many other genes too. And so here, the GMO method allows you to take a specific gene and move it into a plant, knowing where you're going to put it and where it is, and you can easily check that it got there afterwards. So if anything, I think GMO foods are safer than traditional foods. They're not more dangerous at all. So, for developed countries, food isn't a problem. But I think we must never forget that when, for political or greed or whatever, we make arguments about what's going on in our country, we must never forget that those same arguments can be made in developing countries. And very often, the things that we want to improve for ourselves, or statements we want to make for ourselves, don't always translate properly into the developing world. And I always say it would be very good if we could get a lot more science into politics, and incidentally, perhaps a little less politics, in science. Now, one thing that I'm always a little fooled by is the politicians fund science. In the USA, they fund the NIH. in almost every country, the government puts some money into science. When they do this, why don't they listen to the science they fund? Is this asking too much? I mean, what do they think they're doing? They're just a charity giving this money away and they don't care about the results? Well, no, science is probably one of the biggest economic drivers in any country. So they should listen to the scientists and stop supporting the ideas that food produced by modern methods are inherently more dangerous than traditional methods, because they're not. If anything, they're much safer. And I think civil society has to play a role too. It would be nice if the major religious leaders would speak out, because all religions have enormous numbers of followers. You know, if you take the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, there are millions of people around the world who are Catholics. I went to speak to the previous Pope to talk to him about this because I thought we could persuade him to come out with a positive statement. He was unwilling to do so. And at the moment, I'm trying to get an appointment with the new Pope to talk to him about this. These people who have followers have to speak out. You stay silent, you let it all happen. But if you speak up, you can very often stop it. It's important for groups such as the Rotary clubs to speak out. In general, Rotary clubs are a very positive social force. They really care about the people in their communities who support the businesses that the Rotary clubs recommend. I've had a number of talks with Rotary clubs. I go around and talk to them, and they are pro-GMO. I've not come across one yet that was not. Influential celebrities should speak out, although we have to be a little bit careful there. We want to make sure that they really know what they're talking about and not producing some political jargon. And finally, I think the media has a major role to play here. You know, one of the problems we run into at the moment with the media is they like two sides for a story. And they feel, you know, someone's in favor, someone's against, without usually bothering whether 99% are in favor and 1% against, or vice versa. That doesn't matter to them. They just have a story that they can push. And I think the media could do a much better job of helping us. Now, the only good thing I've seen so far from the Roman Catholic Church was this encyclical that came, a circular letter to the bishops from the Pontifical Council in the Vatican. And it said the Eucharistic material, that's the wine and the bread that people take in the Catholic religious services, if that matter is made with genetically modified material, it's okay, it works. I couldn't get the Pope to make a public statement about this, but nevertheless, this was published, so I thought that was rather good. Now, there are some positive signs that are coming along, and I've spent the last few years going around talking to people, trying to influence them, trying to make sure that they would support GMOs whenever possible. So Finland's Green Party now supports GMOs. They were totally against them for a long time. In England, after Brexit, they relaxed the regulations on GMOs. They didn't feel they had to follow the European example anymore. In Germany, this Progressives network supports them. And gene-edited crops, things that have been made by CRISPR, are now becoming much more, I won't say yet completely acceptable, but partially acceptable in many countries. We have 46 countries now have official approval for at least one GMO crop. And the Europeans are finally realizing that the problems that climate is causing in Europe is actually reducing the yields of many of the crops they grow. And I think there are quite a lot of agricultural farmers and politicians in Europe who realize that they're going to have to take on GMO methods and improve the crops that they grow. And of course, soybean around the world is now almost all GMO, but the bulk of it being grown in South America. Now, there are some interesting converts, people who used to be totally anti-GMO who become pro-GMO. One of the most impressive is Patrick Moore. Patrick Moore was the head of Greenpeace, and it was he who came up with this idea that, well, we can blame GMOs and use that to stop Monsanto, and this was all about money. And it was about money because as soon as Greenpeace came out against GMO crops, their income from private donations tripled. Absolutely incredible. Went up to 500 million euros a year just when they came out against GMOs. And it's been continuing that same trend all along. And I think they're afraid that if they now say, well, the science has been done, we've shown that they're safe, that they're going to lose that income. And they also gained a lot of political power as a result of this too. So that was important. Stephen Tyndall used to be the former UK secretary, executive director of Greenpeace in the UK. He was going around burning GM crops. And he finally came around, read the science, found out about the science, and now he's totally pro-GMO. The same with Mark Linus. He also came around. He used to be very anti-GMO, and now he's totally pro-GMO. But one of the people that I am most interested in is Mohammed Nasiru, who was the head of the Peasants Association in Nigeria, in Ghana rather, and he was anti-GMO, totally anti-GMO. He was getting all the peasants against it. He said they're dangerous, we shouldn't be doing this. And he finally took some time off to study the science and to learn the science. And now he's come out and said he's totally pro-GMO. So that is good to have someone in Ghana who feels this way. And I like to sort of end with this. And I say, have a heart. You know, when you think about GM crops, think about the poor people. You know, non-GMO is a Western indulgence of the rich, but it doesn't work for the poor people in Africa who say, will I eat today? Not what will I eat today? In Europe, in here, in many developed countries, we're concerned about what we will eat, not will we eat. Remember, for 800 million people who go to bed hungry every night, there is a solution. GMOs can be the solution. And I think we must push to get them completely accepted. If you want to join us, support precisionagriculture.org, sign on, you can add your name to the list, tell your friends about it. If you want to go out and talk about it, and I would certainly encourage some of you to think about talking at local Rotary clubs, at local schools, to local libraries is something else I do. There are many people who are misinformed completely about GMOs. And I think as scientists, it is our duty to make sure that we tell the science properly to the general public. And there are loads of slides that I've used in talks I've given on this subject. Welcome to download and use any that you want. You can get a copy of previous talks I've given. There's a lot of information on this website that's useful. And so I hope I've convinced you that you should love GMOs. Thank you.